Imagine you are standing inside a museum in Rome. You are looking at one of the most famous paintings in Western history. A pale man with flowing brown hair, bright blue eyes, a long straight nose, and soft European features. He is draped in white and gold. He looks like he could have been born in France, or Spain, or Italy. This, the world has been told for 500 years, is Jesus of Nazareth. But here is the thing that nobody in that museum is talking about. Jesus was born in the Middle East, in a region that today sits between modern-day Israel and Palestine, a region where the average person 2,000 years ago had dark olive skin, dark brown eyes, dark tightly curled hair. And yet, the face of the most worshipped figure in human history looks nothing like the people of that land.
So where did that face come from? That is the question historians, archaeologists, and communities around the world have been asking for decades. And today, we are going to follow that question all the way to its most controversial answer. Because some researchers, some historians, and some very old documents point to a single man. A man who was not a prophet, not a saint, not a holy figure in any way. His name was Caesar Borgia. He was the son of a pope. He was a military warlord. He was alleged by his own contemporaries to be a poisoner, a manipulator, and one of the most feared men in 15th century Europe. And according to a theory that has circulated in historical and academic communities for generations, his face, his actual face, may have become the template for the image of Jesus Christ that billions of people recognize today.
Stay with me. Because this is not a story about religion. This is a story about power, about art, about who gets to write history, and about what happens to the truth when the people holding the pen also happen to be holding the throne. To understand this story, we have to go back to the late 1400s, to a city that controlled the entire Western world, Rome. In 1492, a man named Rodrigo Borgia was elected Pope of the Catholic Church. He took the name Pope Alexander VI. Now, before we go any further, I want you to understand something about this moment in history. The Catholic Church in 1492 was not simply a religious institution. It was a political empire. It controlled land across Europe. It controlled armies. It controlled kings. If a monarch wanted to legitimize his rule, he needed the blessing of Rome. If a trader wanted to conduct business across borders, he needed the blessing of Rome. The church did not just hold spiritual authority. It held the currency of civilization itself. And Rodrigo Borgia understood that better than anyone. He was a shrewd, calculating political operator. He fathered multiple children while serving as a priest and later as a cardinal, which was openly known and widely condemned at the time. And among his children, there was one who would become even more infamous than the Pope himself, Caesar Borgia. Born around 1475, Caesar was educated at some of the finest institutions in Europe. He was intelligent, charismatic, and by most accounts, extraordinarily handsome. He had long, light brown hair, a sharp jawline, light eyes, and the kind of striking physical presence that commanded a room. He was also, according to historians of the period, ruthless in a way that made even his enemies admit a certain dark admiration. Niccolo Machiavelli, the political philosopher who wrote The Prince, is believed by many scholars to have modeled his ideal ruler directly on Caesar Borgia. Think about that for a moment. The man who inspired one of the most influential books on raw political power in all of human history was Caesar Borgia. Now, here is where the story gets complicated. And here is where I want you to pause and think critically with me. Because what I am about to describe is a historical theory. It is not confirmed fact, but it is based on real historical context, real artistic evidence, and real political motivations. The theory goes like this. Pope Alexander VI, Caesar's father, had a problem. The Catholic Church was expanding. It was moving its influence into Africa, into the Middle East, into regions with populations that did not look European. And the figure at the center of that expansion, Jesus of Nazareth, was a man from the Levant, a region that, in that era, would have produced a person who looked more like the people of North Africa or the Middle East than the people of Rome or Florence. Older artistic depictions of Jesus, some dating back to the very earliest centuries of Christianity, did not show a European face. Frescoes found in the catacombs of Rome, dating to as early as the 2nd and 3rd centuries, depicted Jesus as a shorter, darker, more Middle Eastern-looking figure. Ethiopian Orthodox art, which is among the oldest continuous Christian artistic traditions in the world, consistently portrays Jesus and Mary with dark complexions and African features. Coptic Christian art from Egypt carries similar imagery. These traditions were not invented recently. They are ancient. And yet, by the time the European Renaissance reached its peak in the late 1400s and early 1500s, something had changed dramatically. The Jesus appearing in the most celebrated and widely distributed artworks of that era was European, light-skinned, blue-eyed, and in some cases, strikingly similar to the physical descriptions of one specific historical figure, Caesar Borgia. Now, let us talk about the artists, because this theory does not work without them. During the reign of Pope Alexander VI, the most talented painters and sculptors in Italy were working under direct church patronage. That means the church paid their salaries, the church commissioned their work, and the church had significant influence over what those works depicted. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael. These are names we associate with genius, with beauty, with artistic freedom. But in the 1490s and early 1500s, they were also men who needed powerful patrons to survive. And the Borgia family was among the most powerful patrons in Italy. Here is what historians have documented. Leonardo da Vinci was directly connected to Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, who had strong political ties to the Borgia network. Some historians have noted that Caesar Borgia himself employed Leonardo briefly as a military architect and engineer around 1502. The two men were in contact. We know this from Leonardo's own notebooks. Now, I want you to ask yourself a question. If you were the most talented painter in the world, living in an era when powerful men could make or destroy your career, and the son of the Pope walked into your life, would you paint his face? Many artists of that era did exactly that. The practice of using real living people as models for religious figures was not unusual in the Renaissance. What made the Borgia connection different, according to this theory, was not just the modeling. It was the intentional replication and distribution of that image. The church had the power to copy, commission, and circulate specific artistic styles across all of Catholic Europe and beyond. If Rome decided that a particular depiction of Jesus should become the standard, it had the institutional power to make that happen. And here is the political motivation that makes this theory more than just speculation. As European powers began colonizing Africa and the Americas in the late 1400s and 1500s, a European-looking Jesus became a powerful ideological tool. A Jesus who looked like the colonizer was a Jesus who could be used to justify the colonization. A Jesus who looked like the enslaved could have complicated things significantly. Let me ask you something directly.
Do you think it matters what Jesus looked like physically? Drop your answer in the comments right now, because this debate is at the heart of everything we are talking about today.
Now, let us talk about what happened to the older images, because this is where the historical record gets very specific. During the Counter-Reformation, which ran roughly from the mid-1500s to the early 1600s, the Catholic Church launched an enormous campaign to standardize religious art across Europe and its territories. The Council of Trent, which met between 1545 and 1563, issued formal decrees about what religious images should look like, how they should be displayed, and what their purpose was. And while the council did not issue explicit racial guidelines, the practical effect of this standardization was the replacement of regional, indigenous artistic traditions with the European Renaissance style that had been developed under Borgia-era patronage.
In many parts of Africa and Latin America, missionaries actively discouraged or destroyed local religious art that depicted holy figures with indigenous or African features. This was documented by historians of colonialism and by the missionaries themselves, often framed as the removal of what they called primitive or inappropriate depictions. The Jesuit missions across sub-Saharan Africa and the Spanish colonies in the Americas implemented a visual curriculum. Churches were built with European-style iconography. European-produced images were imported and presented as the authoritative, correct representation of biblical figures, and local artistic traditions were suppressed. In places where those traditions survived, it was often because they existed outside the reach of Roman authority.
Ethiopia is the most powerful example of this. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is one of the oldest Christian institutions in the world. It traces its origins to the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch described in the Book of Acts, traditionally dated to the 1st century. Ethiopia was never fully colonized by European powers. The country successfully resisted Italian invasion in 1896 at the Battle of Adwa, which remains one of the most significant military defeats of a colonial power by an African nation in the 19th century. And because Ethiopia maintained its political independence, it also maintained its religious and artistic independence. Ethiopian Orthodox iconography never adopted the European Renaissance depiction of Jesus. Their Christos, their Christ, has distinctly African features: dark skin, dark eyes, features consistent with the East African and Middle Eastern populations that existed in that region 2,000 years ago. And historians who have studied these traditions say this is not a modern invention. Ethiopian Christian art has depicted Jesus this way for over 1,500 years. So here is the question that this raises. If the European image of Jesus was simply the natural and universal development of Christian art, why does the oldest continuous Christian tradition in Africa depict something completely different? And why did European missionaries work so hard to replace that different image? I want you to think about that, because the answer matters. Now let me push further. Think about the role that the European Jesus image played during the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans who were forced to convert to Christianity were presented with a savior who looked like their enslaver. When your God looks like the man who owns you, the theology of submission becomes much easier to enforce. Scholars of African American religious history have written extensively about the psychological dimensions of this dynamic. The image was not just an aesthetic choice, it was a tool. And understanding that history is not about attacking anyone's faith today. It is about understanding the context in which that faith was shaped. What do you think? Was the image of Jesus deliberately changed for political reasons? Or was it simply cultural adaptation? I want to see your honest opinion in the comments. Now, I want to be very clear about something, because this is where responsible historical discussion requires us to slow down. Not every claim in this narrative is equally supported by evidence, and I think you deserve to hear the full picture. So let us talk about what the science actually says, and let us talk about the strongest counterarguments to the Caesar-Borgia theory.
In 2001, a team of forensic scientists and anthropologists working with the BBC reconstructed what a man from first-century Galilee likely looked like. Using skeletal remains from that period and region, along with analysis of historical DNA and physical anthropology data, they produced a reconstruction. The result was not a European face. It was a face with darker skin, dark brown eyes, and short, dark, tightly curled hair. This reconstruction was not a political statement. It was an application of forensic science to a historical question. And it was consistent with what we know about the population of the Levant 2,000 years ago. The ancient Israelites were a Semitic people. Semitic populations in that era, in that geography, under that climate, did not typically produce the physical features depicted in Renaissance European art. This is not controversial among physical anthropologists. It is simply what the evidence shows.
Now, the counter-argument from traditionalist scholars. And I want to give this counter-argument real respect because it is not without merit. The argument goes like this. Religious art has always adapted to the culture of the people who practice that faith. In Japan, traditional Buddhist art depicts the Buddha with Japanese features. In China, Mary and Jesus have been painted with Chinese features in Catholic communities there. In medieval Ethiopia, as we discussed, Jesus was painted with African features. In medieval Europe, Jesus was painted with European features. This, traditionalist scholars argue, is simply the natural process of a universal religion expressing itself through local cultural lenses. It is called inculturation, and it is a legitimate concept in the history of religion and art. So where does that leave the Caesar-Borgia theory specifically? Here is the honest answer. The direct, documented evidence that Caesar Borgia personally modeled for Leonardo da Vinci or for other Renaissance painters specifically to create a standardized image of Jesus is thin. There is no known painting with a verified sitter identification of Caesar Borgia that was also used as a religious icon, with that identification confirmed in a primary document. The theory relies heavily on circumstantial connections. The physical resemblance between Caesar's known portraits and Renaissance depictions of Jesus. The documented professional contact between Caesar and some of the great artists of the era. The clear political motivation that the Borgia papacy had for shaping the visual identity of Christian iconography. And the historical timing, which places the shift toward the European Jesus aesthetic squarely within the period of Borgia influence. These are real connections. They are historically grounded. But they do not constitute proof in the way that a historian would require to make a firm, factual claim.
What we can say with much greater confidence is this. The European light-skinned depiction of Jesus that became globally dominant was produced during a specific historical period. That period coincided with the rise of European colonial power. That image served specific political and ideological functions during the colonial era. And that image displaced older, darker depictions in many parts of the world through institutional power, not through organic artistic evolution. Whether Caesar Borgia's face was the specific template or not, the broader pattern of image replacement is historically documented. And that pattern deserves serious attention.
Here is something I want you to wrestle with. If inculturation is natural and valid, and if that is why European Christians painted a European Jesus, why was so much effort spent suppressing the inculturation of African and indigenous Christian communities? Why was it acceptable for Rome to express Jesus through European features, but not acceptable for Ethiopian, Congolese, or indigenous American Christians to express Jesus through their own features?
That asymmetry is not a small detail. It is the whole argument. Let me know in the comments if you think there is a difference between natural cultural adaptation and institutional image control. Because that line is where this entire debate lives.
Before we get to the conclusion, I want to address something that comes up constantly in discussions like this one, and that is the question of North Africa. Because North Africa is one of the most historically significant regions on the planet. It was home to some of the greatest civilizations in human history: Egypt, Carthage, the Kingdom of Numidia, Roman Africa, the Byzantine African Exarchate. And yet, in most mainstream Western historical narratives, North Africa is frequently depicted as having been predominantly Arab from ancient times. This is historically inaccurate. The Arab conquest of North Africa happened in the 7th century, roughly 600 years after the time of Jesus. Before that conquest, North Africa was predominantly Berber and other indigenous North African populations, with significant Phoenician, Greek, and later Roman influences. The populations of ancient Carthage, of Roman Mauritania, of the kingdoms that predated the Arab expansion were not the same as the populations of the Arabian Peninsula.
This matters for our discussion because the erasure of indigenous African identity from North African history follows a similar pattern to the erasure of darker depictions of Jesus from Christian art. In both cases, a narrative that was more convenient for later power structures was substituted for the more complex historical reality. When we talk about who the people of the ancient Mediterranean and Middle East actually looked like, we have to grapple with the fact that ancient populations were far more diverse than many modern depictions suggest. And we have to grapple with the fact that certain political interests across different centuries and different regimes had strong motivations to simplify and sanitize that diversity.
So where does all of this leave us?
Let me bring this home. We have walked through 500 years of history today. We have looked at the political ambitions of the Borgia papacy. We have examined the artistic context of the Renaissance. We have heard the scientific evidence about what a man from first-century Galilee actually looked like. We have sat with the legitimate counterarguments from traditionalist scholars. And we have traced the way that a specific image, produced in a specific political context, was distributed, enforced, and used across continents and centuries.
The conclusion I want to offer you is not a simple one. It is not the church lied about everything, and it is not none of this matters. The conclusion is this: images have power. The images that a civilization chooses to venerate, to replicate, to distribute, and to impose on others, those images carry ideological weight. They shape how people see themselves. They shape how people see others. And when the history of those images is tangled up with colonialism, with slavery, with political manipulation and institutional power, the people most affected by that history deserve to know it. Not to destroy anyone's faith, not to declare any tradition invalid, but to understand clearly where things came from. Because understanding where something comes from is the first step to deciding, with your own mind and your own conscience, what you want to carry forward. The Ethiopian Orthodox faithful have worshipped a dark-skinned Christ for 1,500 years without interruption. They did not need Rome to tell them what their Savior looked like. And perhaps the lesson in that is simply this: truth, when it is old enough and strong enough, survives the attempts to bury it. Your faith, whatever it is, deserves to be built on real history, not on the artistic choices of a 15th century warlord, not on the institutional convenience of an empire, but on the honest, complex, sometimes uncomfortable truth of what actually happened. And that truth is always worth finding.
I want to end with a question I am going to leave in the comments myself, and I genuinely want to hear your answer.
If the face that billions of people have knelt before for 500 years was shaped, even in part, by the political agenda of men like Caesar Borgia and Pope Alexander VI, does that change anything for you? Does it change your faith? Does it change your understanding of history? Or does it simply make you want to dig deeper? Because that last answer, that desire to dig deeper, is exactly where the real story always begins.
Thank you for watching. If this video made you think, please share it with someone who deserves to know this history. And subscribe, because we are just getting started.